Zelensky just signed his name to a letter addressed to Vladimir Putin, and then he spent that letter needling him, his age, his 26 years in power, the war he started and still can't finish. And he did it out loud on the public record, where every elite in Moscow could read it. That alone should stop you, because this is the first time since 2022 that the Ukrainian president has written directly to Putin and put it in front of the world. And the thing that jumps out isn't the peace offer buried inside it. It's the posture, the confidence. A leader who believed he was losing does not write like this. He doesn't dare a nuclear-armed neighbor to a meeting and slip in jokes about how old the other guy is getting. So the question that's been bouncing around X and the financial desks all weekend is the one we're going to sit with. What does Zelensky know, or think he knows, that makes him comfortable enough to be cheeky with Putin right now? Because confidence in wartime is never free. It's priced off something, off the battlefield, off the factories, off the other side's balance sheet. And when you trace where this confidence is coming from, you end up somewhere the headlines mostly aren't looking. It's the first week of June 2026. The letter went out on the 4th. Putin answered on the 5th. And by the time you're hearing this, the markets have had a weekend to chew on what it means. I'm Professor John. If you want the finance side of these geopolitical turns broken down without the noise, subscribe. It genuinely helps. Now let's get back to that letter, because the timing of it is the whole story. Here's what almost no one outside the defense world fully registered. The day before Zelensky sent it, on June 3rd, Ukrainian drones hit an oil terminal near St. Petersburg and set it on fire roughly 17 kilometers from the venue where Russia was about to open its flagship economic forum. The same night, they struck a Russian corvette at the Kronstadt naval base, the historic home of the Baltic Fleet. St. Petersburg is Putin's hometown. So before a single word of the letter was read, Zelensky had already made his point in fire and smoke. We can reach you. We can reach the room where you sell your country to foreign investors. And we can do it on the calendar that matters most to your image. Then the letter arrives. The message underneath the message is brutal in its simplicity. I just demonstrated the cost of this continuing. Now here's the off-ramp. And the off-ramp itself was real. A full ceasefire for the duration of negotiations, an all-for-all prisoner exchange, the return of abducted Ukrainian children, the United States and Europe at the table, a face-to-face meeting on neutral ground. On paper, it reads like an olive branch. In practice, it was engineered so that whoever says no owns the war. That's the part worth slowing down on, because it tells you the letter was never really written for Putin. Ukrainian officials had been fairly open that the audience was wider. Putin's inner circle, the business elite who were sitting in St. Petersburg watching black smoke drift over their investment showcase, and ordinary Russians who were starting to feel the war in their wallets. The letter was an invitation and a trap at the same time. Come to the table, or be the man who refused peace while your own economy stalls and your own oil terminals burn. And Putin predictably took the bait, the only way he could. On the 5th, from the stage at the St. Petersburg Forum, he rejected it, said he saw no point in a meeting for now, called the letter boorish, said it carried rudeness, said it created obstacles rather than openings. When Zelensky's jabs about his age came up, Putin is 73. He pointed out that plenty of world leaders are older and that what matters isn't age, it's the ability to work. He told Zelensky not to be afraid to hold an election, not to usurp power. And then, in the moment that traveled fastest across social media, he turned away from the letter entirely and addressed his frontline troops instead. 3 words: keep working, brothers. It was meant to look like strength. Watch it twice, and it reads more like a man who didn't want to engage with the substance because the substance was uncomfortable. Zelensky's response came within hours. If Russia rejects even a meeting, then Russia is choosing war. And everyone just heard it, which was, of course, exactly the outcome the letter was built to produce. So that's the surface. A cheeky letter, a cold rejection, a propaganda exchange. If that were all of it, this would be a footnote. But you don't get cheeky from a position of weakness. And Zelensky's team isn't reckless about optics. So let's do the thing the headline skipped. Let's look at the three foundations underneath that confidence and ask whether they actually hold weight or whether Kyiv is bluffing with a thin hand. Start with the ground, the battlefield. And here, I want to be careful because the easy version of this story is wrong. And getting it wrong is how people end up believing comfortable nonsense. Pokrovsk, the logistics hub in Donetsk that Russia threw bodies at for the better part of 2 years, actually fell. Russian forces entered it in late 2025. The city, along with neighboring Myrnohrad, was taken around the turn of the year. That's a real Russian gain. Anyone telling you Ukraine is holding Pokrovsk isn't telling you the truth. But here's where it gets interesting and where Kyiv's confidence starts to make sense. Russia took the city and then couldn't do anything with it. Since December, there's been no meaningful breakthrough west of Pokrovsk or Myrnohrad. The grand operational collapse that capturing that hub was supposed to unlock, the rolling advance across the rest of Donetsk, never materialized. The Institute for the Study of War, in its assessment at the start of June, described Russia's gains as actively declining in 2026, and notably said it wasn't the weather doing it. Spring mud comes and goes. This was something more structural. Ukrainian forces were even reported advancing in the Pokrovsk direction. On the same ground, Russia bled itself white to reach. Step back and look at the whole map, and the picture sharpens. Russia occupies somewhere around 20% of Ukraine. Over the course of all of 2025, by Ukraine's own commander-in-chief's accounting, Russia added roughly 0.8% of Ukrainian territory. Think about what that costs. A year of offensives, a year of casualties that independent analysts put in the hundreds of thousands across the war, a year of artillery and armor and conscripts for less than a single percent of land. That's not a war machine rolling forward. That's a war machine grinding itself down to move the needle a fraction. And the men in Kyiv can see that math just as clearly as the men in Moscow can. Which reframes the letter. When Zelensky tells Putin not to drag this into 2027 and 2028, he's not pleading. He's making a wager grounded in the arithmetic of the front. He's betting that another 2 years buys Russia almost nothing on the ground while costing it everything everywhere else. The taunt about Putin's age lands differently once you understand it that way. It's not a schoolyard insult. It's a clock. You're 73. How many more years of this do you have in you? And what exactly do you have to show for the last 4? That's the first foundation. The front has stopped rewarding Russia at anything close to the rate the casualties demand. Now, the second one, and this is where the finance side of my brain really wakes up, because it's about production. It's about what a country can build. For most of this war, Ukraine has been the smaller industrial power leaning on Western deliveries to stay in the fight. That story is changing, and the speed of the change is the part people underestimate. Ukrainian defense industrial output puts the country's drone production somewhere between 2.5 and 4 million units in 2025, with plans aiming at roughly 7 million across all types in 2026. 7 million. Sit with that number, because it rewires how you think about the war. Drones aren't wonder weapons individually. They're cheap, they're attritable, and at that volume, they change the entire economics of the front line. Every Russian vehicle, every accumulation of troops, every artillery piece now operates under a swarm that costs a fraction of what it kills. And it's not just the small stuff anymore. There's a Ukrainian company called Firepoint that started out building long-range, one-way attack drones, the FP1 series, with a reach reported up to 1,600 kilometers, costing around $55,000 apiece. And they pushed production to something like 100 a day by the middle of last year. 100 deep strike drones a day, each one able to fly the distance from Kyiv to deep inside Russia. Each one cheaper than a used car. That's what Russia's energy infrastructure has been absorbing, hit after hit all year. Then there's the FP5, the Flamingo, a cruise missile made in Ukraine with a reported range of up to 3,000 kilometers and a warhead pushing 1,150 kilograms. That's not a drone with a grenade taped to it. That's a serious strike weapon. And Ukraine started reporting its combat use in late 2025. In February of this year, Ukraine said it used flamingos to hit the Votkinsk plant, a facility well over 1,000 kilometers inside Russia that builds ballistic and cruise missiles, including the kind that can carry nuclear warheads across oceans. Now, I want to flag something honestly here, because precision matters, and I'm not going to sell you certainty I don't have. The Flamingo's exact performance is still debated by missile specialists. Ukraine has confirmed that more than one missile was needed for a single hit. The production numbers are claims. Scaling is hard, and Kyiv keeps a lot of this deliberately murky for operational reasons. So treat the specifics as Ukrainian claims rather than independently verified gospel. But, and this is the point that survives all the caveats, you don't need the most optimistic version to be true for it to matter. Missile analysts have noted that even a steady output of 30 to 50 heavy cruise missiles a month would have tangible effects on this war. Ukraine is no longer just absorbing strikes on its cities. It's building at home the capacity to make Russia's war expensive in places Russia thought were safe. The St. Petersburg oil terminal that caught fire 17 kilometers from the Economic Forum wasn't a fluke. It was a preview of a strategy. And do you see how the two foundations lock together? Russia can't advance on the ground at a rate that justifies the cost. And Ukraine is increasingly able to reach into Russia's economic interior and burn the things that pay for the war: refineries, terminals, rail, the energy industry that bankrolls the Kremlin. That's not a country looking for a ceasefire because it's about to fold. That's a country that thinks the cost curve is finally bending in its favor, which brings us to the third foundation. And honestly, for a finance channel, this is the one that matters most. Because wars aren't ultimately decided by maps. They're decided by money. And Russia's money is starting to talk. For 3 years, the smart-sounding take was that sanctions had failed, that the Russian economy had shrugged off the West, that all the predictions of collapse had been wrong, and there was truth in that. Russia grew over 4% in 2023, nearly 5% in 2024, on the back of enormous defense spending. Economists have a name for it: military Keynesianism. You pour state money into factories that build shells and missiles. Those factories hire workers. Those workers earn wages. Demand surges. And on paper, the economy looks like it's booming. It feels like strength. It is, in a specific and dangerous way, an illusion. Because here's what that spending actually produces. A shell gets fired and it's gone. A drone hits a target and it's gone. A tank burns on a field outside Pokrovsk and it's gone. One analyst at the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center, a former advisor to Russia's own central bank, described it bluntly as a disposable goods economy. The factories run at full capacity, the wages get paid, but the output is designed to vanish almost immediately, and it gets worse. Because the bill doesn't stop when the fighting does. The payments owed to dead and wounded soldiers and their families keep landing on the budget for years after the last shot. You're not building wealth. You're converting your reserves and your young men into smoke. And in 2026, the smoke is clearing enough to see what's left. The story now is a slowdown sliding towards stagnation, with serious people, including Russian officials, openly raising the word recession. Last year, Russia's own economy minister stood at that same St. Petersburg forum and warned the country was on the brink of a recession. This year, the government quietly downgraded its expected growth by almost a full percentage point, from around 1.3% down to roughly 0.4%, from nearly 5% growth to barely above zero in 2 years. Officials have a euphemism for it. They call the boom years overheating and the present managed cooling. Managed as if a war economy running out of workers and reserves is something you steer gently into a soft landing. It isn't being managed. It's hitting walls. Labor shortages, because you can't send 1 million men to the front and to the factories and to the graveyard and still staff the civilian economy. Inflation that the central bank has been fighting with brutal interest rates. The loss of Western technology that you can't fully replace with Chinese substitutes, production bottlenecks, and underneath all of it, a demographic decline that predates the war and that the war is accelerating. The Carnegie analysis put it starkly. Russia has largely exhausted its reserves of manufacturing capacity and manpower. To produce meaningfully more, Moscow would have to go to full World War II-style mobilization, commandeering car plants for military vehicles. And the Kremlin won't do that, because creating shortages of consumer goods is how you get social unrest. So Putin is caught. He can't escalate the economy without risking the home front, and he can't sustain the current pace forever. Now hold that next to the image from this week. Black smoke hanging over St. Petersburg as the country opened its showcase for foreign investment. Putin on stage acknowledging, and I'll quote him directly because the phrasing is telling, that he hears criticism from all sides that everything has collapsed. When the man running the war feels the need to deny collapse at his own economic forum, while a Ukrainian drone strike burns nearby, the metaphor writes itself. And he still refused to cut defense spending. The ISW assessment noted he's resisting pressure from his own economic officials to ease off. Defense and national security together are eating something like 38% of federal expenditure. Defense alone running near 7% of GDP. He's doubling down on the disposable goods economy precisely as it runs out of road. Why? Probably because he believes he can win before it breaks. That's the bet on his side of the table. And it's a bet against a clock. So now put all three foundations together, the way Zelensky's strategists clearly have. The front isn't moving for Russia. Ukraine can increasingly burn Russia's economic organs from 1,000 kilometers away. And the Russian economy is shifting from boom to stagnation, with recession openly discussed by its own ministers. From Kyiv's chair, the conclusion isn't that Ukraine can march to Moscow. It's quieter and more dangerous than that. It's that time may be turning into Ukraine's weapon, that every month this drags on, Russia pays more and gains less. And a letter that taunts Putin about dragging the war into 2027 and 2028 is, underneath the cheek, a financial argument. It's saying, do the math on 2 more years of this. You'll be poorer, older, and standing on the same line in the mud. That's why he could be cheeky. Not because he's certain of victory. Nobody sane is certain of anything in this war. But because he's read the cost curves and concluded that confidence is itself a tool. Project Strength. Force Putin to reject peace in public. Deepen the doubt among the Russian elites watching their forum burn, and let the economic gravity do the slow work. But, and this is the one place I'll let myself use that phrase, there's a harder edge to this that the optimistic version glosses over. And as a finance person, I can't let it slide. Confidence and capability are not the same thing. Ukraine's ability to sustain this still leans heavily on the outside world, and the outside world is wobbling. Look at what happened in Washington this same week. On June 4th, the House passed a major Ukraine support package, more than $1 billion in security and reconstruction aid, another $8 billion in financing for arms, plus sanctions on Russian oil, gas, mining, and banks. Even a 500% tariff on Russian goods. Sounds like a wall of support. Read the vote count. It passed 226 to 195, and it only got to the floor because 18 Republicans defied their own leadership and the president to force it through a discharge petition. The president's focus has been on Iran, not Ukraine, and at one point, he even loosened restrictions on Russian oil to keep global prices down during the Iran crisis. The bill now faces a Senate where it needs 60 votes, and where similar measures have already stalled. Translate that for the markets. American support for Ukraine is no longer a given that flows automatically. It's contested. It's procedural. It's one discharge petition away from dying in committee. And that uncertainty is precisely the gap Zelensky's letter was designed to paper over. When he writes that Washington is fully focused on Iran and that it would be wrong to simply wait, he's not making an observation. He's managing a vulnerability. He's telling Russia, and frankly telling his own Western backers, that Ukraine doesn't intend to sit still and become dependent on a peace process that may never start. The confidence is real, but part of it is also performance. aimed at keeping the money flowing while the politics in Washington fracture. And the oil angle ties the whole thing into your portfolio more directly than you might think. Ukraine's strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, the new U.S. sanctions, the proposed ban on Russian crude, all of it pressures supply. We saw what targeted sanctions on the big Russian producers did earlier, sending crude up around 5% in a single session. And yet the longer-term forecasts point the other way, toward a glut. With major banks projecting Brent drifting toward the mid-50s and U.S. crude into the low 50s by year-end as production rises elsewhere. So you've got two opposing forces, geopolitical strikes and sanctions pushing prices up, a structural oversupply pushing them down. For Russia, that's a vice. Its entire war is financed by energy revenue, and it's getting squeezed from both jaws at once. Physical attacks on the infrastructure and a market that may not give it the high prices it desperately needs. That, more than any letter, may be what eventually forces a reckoning. Here's the thread I keep pulling on, though. If the economic and battlefield logic really does favor Ukraine over time, and if Zelensky genuinely believes that, then why offer peace at all? Why not just wait it out? And I think the answer is the most honest thing in this whole story. Because time favoring you isn't the same as time being kind to you. Every month, Ukraine wins on the cost curve. Ukrainian cities still get hit. 6 killed in Kyiv, 16 in Dnipro in a single early June attack so heavy it shook people who'd already endured years of it. 12 more killed across the country the day the letter went public. Children still aren't home. So Kyiv is doing something genuinely difficult, projecting the confidence of a side that thinks it's winning the long game while carrying the grief of a country that pays for every day of that long game in blood. The cheek in the letter and the desperation behind it are the same letter. That's not weakness. That's two true things at once. Putin read it and saw only the cheek. He answered with contempt and turned to his troops. Keep working, brothers. But the elites in that room in St. Petersburg, watching the smoke, looking at a growth rate that fell from 5% to almost nothing, hearing their own ministers whisper about recession, some of them, the Ukrainians, are betting, read the other thing, the clock, the math, the question of how many more disposable years a disposable goods economy has left in it. So here's what I'll leave you with. We're trained to think the confident party in a negotiation is the one with the most weapons on the table today. But what if real confidence isn't about who's strongest right now? What if it's about who can most credibly say they'll still be standing and still building in 2028? If that's the game Zelensky is actually playing, then the cheekiest line in that whole letter wasn't a joke about Putin's age. It was the quiet refusal to be in a hurry. And the only person in this story who truly can't afford to wait might be the one who insists he has all the time in the world. This is Professor John. I'll see you in the next one.